The bloodiest battle in history wasn't fought with swords or cannons, it was fought with spoons and supply chains. Generals spent sleepless nights calculating tonnage while their enemies slept soundly. But there's one shocking reason why feeding an army breaks more backs than breaking enemy lines ever could. When Alexander the Great decided to conquer the known world, he wasn't just planning battle strategies and siege tactics. He was basically running the world's first massive catering operation. And let me tell you, feeding 300,000 people daily makes your neighborhood barbecue look like child's play. Think about it this way. Your local grocery store probably serves a few thousand families. Now multiply that by 50 and imagine they all need to eat the same day in the middle of nowhere, with no delivery trucks coming. That's what ancient generals faced every single morning they woke up. But here's where it gets really wild. These armies couldn't just swing by the local farmer's market and pick up some fresh vegetables. They had to systematically strip entire regions of their food supplies. Makes sense, right? When 50,000 hungry soldiers march into your territory, subtle grocery shopping isn't exactly an option. Ancient armies operated like locust swarms, except with armor and weapons. They'd descend on farming communities and basically vacuum up everything edible. Grain stores that were meant to last families through winter, gone in a day. Livestock that represented years of careful breeding. Dinner for the troops. The numbers are absolutely staggering when you break them down. Alexander's forces alone consumed roughly 3,000 tons of grain every month. That's equivalent to about 6 million loaves of bread. Every 30 days, rain or shine, victory or defeat, those stomachs needed filling. Then there's the logistics nightmare that would make modern supply chain managers weep. Picture thousands of oxen pulling creaking wagons across muddy roads, carrying sacks of grain heavier than small cars. These supply trains stretched for miles behind the actual army, creating what looked like the world's slowest, most vulnerable parade. Smart enemies figured this out pretty quickly. Why face 50,000 armed warriors when you could just burn their dinner? Attacking supply lines became an art form. Cut off the food, and even the mightiest army would collapse faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The Romans actually had a saying that captures this perfectly. An army marches on its stomach. Not on its courage, not on its weapons, but on its stomach. Because hungry soldiers don't just perform poorly, they mutiny. They desert. They turn into angry mobs instead of disciplined fighting units. Well, gathering all that food was just the beginning of the nightmare. Once you had thousands of tons of provisions, you faced an even bigger challenge: moving thousands of tons of grain across hostile territory. That's like trying to deliver pizza during a hurricane, except the hurricane lasts months and people are actively trying to kill your delivery drivers. Ancient armies faced a nightmare that would make modern logistics managers quit on the spot. Every mile traveled meant more opportunities for disaster. Muddy roads turned supply wagons into stuck monuments. Rivers flooded without warning, washing away weeks of provisions. Mountain passes became death traps where a single rock slide could starve an entire legion. But weather was the least of their problems. Enemy raiders treated supply lines like all-you-can-eat buffets. They'd swoop in, steal the food, burn the wagons, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. One successful raid could force a victorious army into retreat faster than any battlefield defeat. Talk about hitting where it hurts most. The math was brutal too. A typical Roman legion needed about 600 tons of supplies monthly, moving that required hundreds of oxen, thousands of wagons, and even more men to guard them. The supply train often stretched longer than the army itself. Makes sense, right? Then there's the speed problem. While armies could march 20 miles per day, heavily loaded ox carts barely managed 5. This meant supply convoys had to leave days or weeks ahead of the main force, traveling through dangerous territory with minimal protection. It's like sending your lunch money through a neighborhood full of bullies. Hannibal learned this lesson the hard way, crossing the Alps. His brilliant strategic mind couldn't outsmart basic physics and geography. Narrow mountain paths meant single-file movement for days. One broken wheel, one spooked animal, one avalanche, and suddenly 50,000 men were facing starvation in sub-freezing temperatures. Well, commanders developed creative solutions. Some armies lived off the land, essentially becoming mobile locust swarms that stripped entire regions bare. Others established supply depots every few days' march, creating a breadcrumb trail of provisions. The smartest generals realized that controlling river routes and roads was often more valuable than winning battles. And the weird part is, successful supply management required more planning than actual warfare. Roman quartermasters spent months calculating grain requirements, organizing transport schedules, and mapping supply routes before a single soldier drew his sword. Many campaigns ended not with dramatic final battles, but with armies simply running out of food and trudging home defeated by their own stomachs. But even when supplies reached their destination safely, keeping them fresh presented an entirely different set of challenges that could doom an expedition just as quickly. Ancient armies faced a cruel irony. They could capture entire cities but lose everything to a few moldy sacks of grain. Storing food without modern technology was like trying to keep ice cream frozen in the desert. Technically possible, but you'd better have a brilliant plan. Roman granaries weren't just storage buildings, they were architectural marvels that would make modern warehouse managers weep with envy. These fortress-like structures featured thick stone walls, elevated floors to prevent moisture damage, and intricate ventilation systems that circulated air better than most apartments today. Well, maybe that's an exaggeration, but you get the point. The Romans understood something we often forget. Location matters. Smart? Absolutely. But here's the kicker. Even with perfect conditions, armies typically lost 30 to 50% of their stored food to spoilage, insects, and rodents. Think rats were just a minor annoyance? Think again. A single rat family could destroy enough grain to feed 10 soldiers for a week. Ancient quartermasters became obsessed with pest control, employing everything from cats to elaborate traps. Some Roman forts had more cats than cavalry horses, but the real genius lay in understanding air circulation. Ancient engineers discovered that moving air prevented the moisture buildup that turned grain into expensive compost. They created sophisticated ventilation shafts and used ceramic pipes to channel airflow, basically ancient air conditioning for food storage. Then there's the temperature factor. Underground storage kept provisions cool during scorching summers, while thick walls provided insulation during harsh winters. Roman engineers even calculated optimal storage depths based on local climate conditions. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were precision-engineered food preservation systems. Storage containers mattered too. Clay amphora with tight-fitting lids created mini-environments that protected contents from humidity and pests. Different grain types required different storage methods. Wheat needed drier conditions than barley, while legumes demanded entirely separate facilities to prevent cross-contamination. The psychological aspect was equally crucial. Soldiers fought harder knowing their provisions were secure. Conversely, rumors about spoiled supplies could trigger panic faster than enemy cavalry charges. Smart commanders regularly displayed their well-stocked granaries to boost morale. Ancient military theater at its finest. Even with perfect storage, time remained the ultimate enemy. Fresh bread lasted days, dried grain lasted months, but eventually everything succumbed to nature's relentless march. This created a constant race against time that made military campaigns as much about calendar management as battlefield tactics. Speaking of time running out, there was one threat even the best-designed granaries couldn't prevent, and it had nothing to do with rot or rats. You know what's funny? We obsess over expiration dates on our yogurt, but ancient armies had to deal with food going bad when there wasn't a Walmart for 300 miles. And trust me, spoiled military rations could end a campaign faster than any enemy charge. Tropical climates were absolute nightmares for food preservation. Within hours, meat would start reeking worse than a teenager's gym socks. Bread turned moldy quicker than you could say, retreat. And anything remotely fresh became a science experiment nobody wanted to taste. Roman legions marching through North Africa learned this lesson the hard way, sometimes losing half their provisions before they even reached the battlefield. But here's where it gets interesting. Ancient armies became masters of preservation out of pure desperation. Salting meat wasn't just a cooking technique, it was survival technology. Soldiers would pack pork and beef in so much salt, it looked like it had been through a blizzard. Smoking was another lifesaver, literally. Picture massive smokehouses following armies around like some bizarre culinary parade. The Spartans, those tough-as-nails warriors we all admire, had their famous black broth. Sounds disgusting, right? Well, It was, but that awful concoction lasted weeks without spoiling, which made it more valuable than gold when you're stuck in hostile territory. Sometimes the worst tasting food was exactly what kept you alive. Then there's the preservation arms race nobody talks about. Armies that it's like having a bigger gas tank. Suddenly you could reach places your enemies couldn't even dream of attacking. The Vikings mastered dried fish so well they could sail for months, while their enemies were still figuring out how to keep cheese from turning green. Without proper preservation techniques, armies were basically playing a giant game of beat the clock with their stomachs. Spoilage rates could hit 50% or higher during summer campaigns. Makes you appreciate your refrigerator, doesn't it? The cruel irony? Ensuring fresh provisions often proved more challenging than actual battle strategies. Generals spent more time worried about rotting grain than enemy formations. And when preservation failed, nutritional deficiencies kicked in fast. Weakened soldiers meant weakened armies, and weakened armies meant certain defeat. But even the cleverest preservation methods couldn't solve every problem. Because while you're busy smoking your meat and salting your vegetables, enemies are busy plotting something far more sinister. And they're not just coming for your territory. What did a Roman soldier eat for breakfast? The same thing he had for lunch and dinner for months. We're talking about bread, porridge, and more bread. Maybe some beans if they were lucky. Their diet made modern military MREs look like a five-star buffet. At least today's soldiers get chicken teriyaki and beef stew options. These ancient warriors got creative with gruel. The typical Roman legionnaire carried enough wheat to last 16 days. That's it. 16 days between him and starvation. They'd grind it into flour using hand mills that weighed more than a bowling ball, then bake rock-hard biscuits that could probably stop an arrow. Some historians joke that Roman bread was so tough, it doubled as armor. But here's where it gets interesting. Soldiers actually preferred this monotony. Why? Because predictable food meant reliable energy. No stomach surprises before battle. No wondering if today's mystery meat would leave you doubled over in pain while facing a charging cavalry. Greek soldiers had it even worse with their famous black broth. This lovely concoction mixed pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. Sounds appetizing, right? One Spartan king supposedly tasted it and declared he finally understood why Spartans weren't afraid to die. Death seemed preferable to another bowl of that stuff. Medieval armies survived on what they called iron rations, basically hardtack biscuits and salted pork. The biscuits were so hard that soldiers would soak them in wine or water just to avoid breaking their teeth. Some clever fellows used them as plates. Talk about multi-purpose dining. Fresh vegetables? Forget about it. Fruit? Only if they happened to march through an orchard. Most armies went months without anything resembling fresh produce. Scurvy became as much an enemy as opposing forces. Soldiers' teeth would fall out, their gums would bleed, and they'd develop mysterious bruises. The psychological toll was brutal too. Nothing destroys morale like eating the same flavorless mush day after day. Modern research shows that food variety directly impacts mental health. Imagine marching 20 miles daily on nothing but stale bread and questionable water. Then there were the camps where cooks would throw whatever they could find into massive pots. Boots, rats, tree bark. If it fit in the cauldron and wouldn't immediately poison everyone, it became dinner. One chronicler described army soup as everything but the kitchen sink, mainly because they didn't have kitchen sinks. While maintaining these boring diets was only half the battle. The real challenge? Making sure food actually stayed edible long enough to bore the soldiers. When your grandmother complains about her food going bad in 3 days, remind her that ancient armies would have killed for that luxury. Back then, keeping food fresh for even 24 hours was like winning the lottery. Drying became the grandfather of all preservation methods. Soldiers would slice meat paper thin and hang it on makeshift racks, turning fresh beef into something that resembled leather shoe soles. But here's the thing. Those shoe soles could last months without rotting. Vegetables got the same treatment. Beans, peas, and grains were spread under scorching sun until every drop of moisture evaporated. The Romans perfected this art to an almost ridiculous degree. They dry everything from onions to entire fish, creating what basically amounted to the world's first trail mix. Except instead of being a hipster snack, it meant survival or death. Salt curing was where things got expensive fast. Salt wasn't just seasoning. It was liquid gold that happened to be crystalline. A pound of salt could cost more than a soldier's monthly wages, yet armies had no choice but to invest heavily in it. Here's where it gets interesting. Curing meat with salt drew out moisture like a sponge soaking up spilled wine. Bacteria can't survive without water, so salted meat became practically immortal. Roman soldiers carried salt pork that was older than some of their girlfriends back home, and it was still perfectly edible. But the preservation game wasn't just about making food last longer, it determined how far an army could march from civilization. Better preservation meant longer campaigns. Longer campaigns meant conquering territories that seemed impossible to reach. The Vikings figured out smoking techniques that would make modern barbecue pitmasters weep with envy. They'd build special smokehouses that could process hundreds of fish simultaneously. Their preserved salmon could survive ocean voyages lasting months. Then there's the innovation factor. Armies that cracked the preservation code gained massive strategic advantages. They could siege enemy cities for years while their opponents starved within weeks. The Mongols developed a fermented milk product that never spoiled. Talk about thinking outside the box. Salt became so valuable that armies would change entire battle plans just to secure salt mines. Controlling salt meant controlling preservation. Controlling preservation meant controlling warfare itself. But even with all these clever techniques, ancient armies still faced one brutal reality that made preservation look like child's play. Enemy forces weren't content to just fight fair battles. They had much dirtier tricks up their sleeves. You know how modern armies worry about cyber attacks and missile strikes? Well, ancient generals lost way more sleep over something far simpler, keeping their food wagons from getting hijacked. Enemy raiders didn't need fancy weapons to cripple an entire army. They just needed to know where the dinner was heading. Night attacks on supply convoys were absolutely devastating. Makes sense, right? Why face 50,000 angry soldiers with swords when you could starve them out by hitting a few hundred supply guys with sticks? Raiders would strike fast, burn the grain wagons, scatter the livestock, and disappear before anyone could mount a proper defense. Suddenly, you've got an army that's about as useful as a chocolate teapot. But the real nightmare was sabotage. Enemy spies didn't just steal food, they poisoned it. Wells got contaminated with dead animals or toxic plants. Stored grain would mysteriously develop a case of the mysterious green fungus. It's like ancient biological warfare, except instead of fancy labs, they used rotting fish and creative thinking. The paranoia this created was incredible. Roman commanders assigned more guards to their supply depots than some cities had defending their entire walls. Armed escorts became standard for every grain wagon, turning simple food delivery into a military operation that would make modern security companies jealous. Then there's betrayal, the gift that keeps on giving. Local guides who knew the terrain would lead supply trains straight into ambushes. Corrupt quartermasters sold provisions to the highest bidder, leaving soldiers wondering why dinner suddenly tasted like tree bark and disappointment. One careless moment, one greedy official, and your entire campaign could collapse faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Julius Caesar was notorious for this kind of warfare. During his Gallic campaigns, he didn't just fight battles, he orchestrated elaborate schemes to cut enemy supply lines while protecting his own. The man treated food logistics like chess, except the pieces were actual people, and losing meant everyone starved. The psychological impact was brutal, too. Soldiers who constantly worried about their next meal couldn't focus on fighting. They'd hear hoofbeats at night and immediately think, there goes breakfast, instead of preparing for battle. It turned entire armies into nervous wrecks. Well, speaking of nervous wrecks, nothing quite compared to what happened when the food actually ran out completely. Because when 50,000 hungry soldiers start eyeing each other's boots as potential snacks, you've got a whole different kind of problem on your hands. When your stomach starts growling during a meeting, you might lose focus for a few minutes. Well, multiply that by 50,000 soldiers holding sharp weapons, and you've got yourself a military nightmare that makes enemy cavalry charges look like a gentle morning jog. Hunger didn't just make ancient soldiers cranky, it turned them into walking disasters. A starving army was like trying to run a Ferrari on fumes. Everything looked impressive from the outside, but good luck getting anywhere meaningful. Soldiers operating on empty stomachs made tactical blunders that would make a chess beginner wince. Their reaction times slowed, their decision-making became as cloudy as week-old soup, and their famous military discipline crumbled faster than stale bread. But here's where it gets really ugly. Desperate commanders often forced their famished troops into battles they had no business fighting simply because waiting meant watching their army waste away. It's like being dealt a terrible poker hand but having to go all in because your chips are literally evaporating. These hunger-driven engagements rarely ended well, turning what could have been strategic retreats into catastrophic defeats. The breakdown of discipline was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. Roman legions were legendary for their order and coordination, but introduced severe hunger into the mix, and those perfectly drilled formations started looking more like angry mobs. Soldiers began deserting, stealing from each other, and questioning orders. Makes sense, right? Hard to respect authority when that authority can't provide basic meals. Julius Caesar understood this brutal math better than most. During the siege of Alesia, he essentially played the world's deadliest game of who blinks first with food supplies. Caesar managed his logistics so brilliantly that he starved out Vercingetorix's much larger Gallic force. The Romans literally ate their way to victory while their enemies grew weaker by the day. Caesar didn't just outfight his opponents, he outate them. And the weird part is, this wasn't some revolutionary strategy. Every experienced commander knew that controlling food meant controlling the outcome. Yet armies kept failing at this fundamental task, getting distracted by flashy tactics and impressive weaponry while neglecting the unglamorous business of keeping soldiers fed. History books love to focus on brilliant battle maneuvers and heroic charges, but the real deciding factor was often much simpler. The army that solved its food problem usually won, while the army that didn't found itself surrendering not to superior tactics, but to the most basic human need of all. Sometimes the most powerful weapon on any battlefield wasn't made of steel. It was made of bread.